Okay, chapter 7, cognitive development and cognitive processes. So this is going to build on what we did in the previous chapters with regard to Piaget and things of that nature. So this really breaks cognitive development down into its pieces and parts, okay? So let's go here to key ideas. Sensation and perception. I mean, literally highlight these for yourself because these are the things I'm going to quiz you on. These are the things that I want you to elaborate on. These are the things that will be part of our discussion. Sensation and perception, what are those? What's the difference? The difference between sensory register, working memory, long-term memory, and then the different ways that attention can kind of screw all that up in the classroom and make learning difficult. Moving things from working memory into long-term memory and the ways that we can use to do that, some of the ways. And then the central executive, okay? So the central executive, you're going to hear it talked about in a couple of different ways. In your book, it's central executive. In everyday conversation around your school, you're going to hear executive functions, okay? Executive function disorder, or there's an executive function disorder usually involved in the diagnosis of attention deficit disorder, okay? So those two are just know that those words are interchangeable, central executive and executive function. So here's a little chart of everything we're going to go over. So you have the central executive that sort of pulls things, right? So close your eyes right now and bring to mind a hippopotamus. Okay, got that sort of visualization going on in your mind. You have just pulled your knowledge of the word hippopotamus, your visual memory of a hippopotamus, and you've pulled it in through with your central executive, right? So into your executive function. Now I'm going to ask you to turn that pink. Everybody got that? So now you have pulled from what you know to be pink and you have integrated it with your visual memory and your visual representation in your central executive of a pink hippopotamus. You can even do more with that. You can turn it upside down. So now you can do spatial. So you've done language here, you've done visual memory, you've done colors, you've done shapes, you've done form, and you've done spatial manipulation. All of that is happening in the frontal lobe, pulling on long-term memory and using things in working memory in order to do that. That's the exact same process when you try to get a kid to say, what's 1 times 2? Right? Those sort of memorized facts. And then you take that foundation and then you connect it to more complex things. And eventually you end up with like calculus and trigonometry, right? And you do all of those kinds of functions. Some functions are too big to manage in working memory. So mental math, only a small amount of mental math can be done before you have to start being able to write things down on paper to get a better visual organization of it. Okay, hope that makes sense. So let's go over everything. Sensation is detecting stimuli in the environment. So what does this mean? It means that you do not see with your eyes or hear with your ears or feel with your fingertips. All you do is collect data from the environment. So pressure, temperature, color through the eyes, sound waves through the ears. Those all just create neural signals, impulses that go up the nerves, into the spinal cord into the brain, and then based on those signals, your brain processes things like color that you have learned to associate with red. Okay, so you perceive in your brain. So in order to really truly understand the environment and to learn, you have to be able to translate those senses into perception in various parts of your brain, okay? So detecting a sensation, interpreting stimuli into everything else that we know about the world is perception, okay? So that is why if you damage a part of your brain, you all of a sudden can't see color. It's not necessarily because you have damaged the rods and the cones. I mean, that could happen, but not in this case. It just goes to a part of the brain that cannot recall or bring together what those things mean, okay? There's books out there like The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and stuff of that nature that look at brain damage that causes misperception. Or in the cases of things like aphasia, you've heard of people who know what they want to say, but when they try to get the words out, they say nonsense syllables. It's because the part of their brain that organizes all of that can't bring that out in a functional way. Okay, so perception and experience and everything that we do happens in our brain. And the rest of our body is there to communicate data to the brain to make sense of it. Okay, so what are the developmental changes? Newborns are born with lots of capacities. They respond to sights and sounds and tastes and smells. Sight is not as good early on as as smell, for example. They are born preferring new and interesting stimuli, so what we call novel stimuli, meaning that they will stare longer at something they've never seen before. There is, interestingly, also a preference for social stimuli. So preferences for mother's voice, faces, they will immediately turn to locate the source of people talking, the source of sounds. That's why some of the mobiles that we have people's faces on them. And the reason they're often in black and white is because sight and color and those sorts of things don't develop in the early infant. Okay, they develop quickly, but not in the kind of newborn early infant. So they improve dramatically during infancy, right? This is the phase that Piaget called the sensory motor phase. So this is where everything is experienced as a sensory experience, and we're learning vision, we're learning depth perception, we're learning, think about that. You have to learn how to crawl through space and things are being stable. You have to be exposed to things in order for this to happen. Nature and nurture both play a role. Okay, so now there's this idea of attention. So what you attend to is what you will learn and remember. So again, with babies, it's novelty and it's people, but they're interested in everything, okay? And it develops in the context of social interaction. So they prefer faces because faces also, they move and they smile and then they start to mimic, and there's a joint attention. We call it mutual gazing. And mutual gazing leads to emotional bonding, which is why I always tell parents it's so important to look at your baby during times of like breastfeeding or bottle feeding, because that time of mutual gazing is really what impacts the bond. It's the warmth, it's the cuddling, it's the sensations, the smell, the eye gazing, and then you start to have babies starting to mimic what they see, which if you think about it is interesting. It's an inborn capacity to do that. The smile muscles and things of that nature. So as we get older, we expect distractibility to decrease and the capacity for sustained attention to increase. And that our attention becomes increasingly purposeful, meaning that we have control over what we choose to attend to, okay? Working memory and the central executive. Working memory, I've kind of already gone over this. It enables people to think actively and process small amounts of information at a time. So you can pull things into working memory, but while you're learning, you also take things from your sensation, your sensory register, bring it into your working memory, and then if you rehearse it and rehearse it and rehearse it enough and use some other ways of doing it, you move that from working memory into long-term memory, okay? And the central executive, or the executive function, manages the flow of all of this information from the outside to the inside, back again in working memory, bringing things in to create problem solving and complex thinking and developing theories and doing mental math, and all of those things happen with those functions that occur in the frontal lobe. All right, so long-term memory is where the stuff you know exists. The stuff you know can either be content, which are sort of your nouns, and procedures, which is like almost motor things, like how to do, it's not just motor, it's how to do something. So riding a bike, driving a car, 1 + 1, adding, subtracting, dividing, that kind of thing. Whereas the content of what you know is more like, well, see that example, where are the cookies? It's not just where are things, it's what is a cookie, remembering where they are, remembering which formula. So the formula itself is procedural, but the content is which math formula do I use for this problem? Okay, that's content. So by universal, what we mean here is that everyone has long-term memory, everyone has content and procedures. What is culturally specific is what the culture values, different procedures, right? Like, have you ever gone someplace and go, God, the stuff they eat is weird, but that's all they've ever known. So culturally, they have a certain kind of taste sensation, certain sensory memories, and comfort food is different for different cultures. So the content and the procedures may be culturally specific, but the fact that these things exist are universal. Long-term memory has an unlimited capacity. You know that. If you've ever thought of song lyrics that you haven't thought of in a really long time because they've been triggered by something else. But memories that last longer are the ones who are used frequently. That's why you're always having to practice, and that's what continuing education is for. All right. It is believed, it is postulated, and it is researched that sounds and tastes begin to form in memory traces, in a sensory memory trace, not a language one, but a sensory memory trace, in the womb before birth, which is why you always have moms talking to their bellies or putting headphones on their bellies. That's really what that's for. In terms of conscious, what they mean by that is it's more directed. There's when you're in preschool, you're not just, how do we say this? So when I talk to parents about toddlers, for example, when toddlers do something wrong, I don't recommend discipline because it's a moment of teaching. We don't hit, we don't bite, we don't do whatever it is you don't want them to do. And then we give them a replacement, right? We're nice to people, we're kind to people. These things are important. These are abstract concepts, right? We're also teaching toddlers all these things. And they're moving things into long-term memory, but in preschool, by the time they're in preschool, say 3, 3.5, 4, they're ready to consciously learn. That's when you have a math table and a science table, and they're counting and they're learning letters. It's a very conscious attempt to move things into long-term memory. Obviously, the amount of stored knowledge increases dramatically. Think about the first 5 years of life and everything that has to be accomplished. Your knowledge of vocabulary and objects and words and feelings and smells and tastes of food. You know, if you don't have long-term memory, you could eat a burger today and say, oh my God, I don't like meat. And then the next time you have a burger you're presented with, you're like, oh, I don't remember anything about this, right? Whereas little kids by 3 are like, I don't like it. I don't like the way it tastes, and they won't have it ever again. That means that it's been put into long-term memory, okay? And then over time, knowledge becomes more integrated into schemas and scripts. So not everything that flies is a bird. Bird, bird, bird. Then they point to a bird and you say no airplane. Now there are things that fly that are broken down into birds and airplanes. And then you have transportation, which they start to learn. Buses and trains and things of that nature fall into a schema. And the more resources they are exposed to, the more integrated and complex their schemas and scripts are for how to sort of get through life, right? And then the autobiographical self, which is their concept of me. I am a girl. I am a boy. That starts at 3. I am separate from mom. I am separate from dad. I want to marry dad. You can't marry dad. We're going to talk about all that emotional development. But they start to describe themselves. But over time, the autobiographical self starts out with, I am a girl, I am 3. And then as you get older, I am kind, I'm a nice person, I follow the rules, I'm a good friend. And your idea of yourself develops into a broader and more complex schema. All right, so reasoning. Reasoning develops with this increased use of symbols. So symbolic thought, which is language, right? So a symbol. The word ball is a symbol for the thing ball. To understand what a ball is and call it by name, you have to understand its form. You have to understand the symbol that's associated with it. You need to be able to hear that. Eventually, you're going to be able to read that. You're going to associate all of those things together. Okay, so then you go into sort of higher levels of reasoning. So you can figure out like which of these things is not a ball, because then you're going to have soccer balls, basketballs, right? Those kind of things. And then you sort of test that with, well, which one of these things is not a ball? Logical thinking starts with the most basic cause and effect. So if you've ever seen infancy, kids as they get a little bit older but are still in their high chairs, like you put a dish on the thing and they push it off the side and it falls, parent picks it up, puts it on there, and they do it again. Why are they doing that? Because they're actually learning that their hand can be used as a tool and that they did a thing. And so when given the opportunity, as little scientists that they are, to do it again, they're going to do it again, and they're going to push that thing off the cliff again. By the time you get to preschool, you start having logical thinking like, given the story we just told, what's likely to happen next? Okay? And then as you get older, what are they thinking and feeling? Or was this right or wrong? And those kinds of things. Influenced by personal bias just means what you think is best, right? So the egocentrism of childhood. Gestures. If you've ever seen those kids, the infants that are babbling, but their tone and intonation and their gestures are very much mimicking the adults, that's sort of pre-language, and it's their way of experimenting with cognitive ideas. And it is a foreshadowing of emerging for more sophisticated skill. So it's telling us that language is about to burst out, right? They're about to hit that plateau, and they're going to become a speaker, right? Person who's using language. And the same then can be seen with regard to reading. So how do you facilitate all of this? In very young children, you want to provide a variety of sensory experiences. You want to help them pay attention to things that are important. So think about this. At first, when you're reading, let's think about reading. At first, when you're reading, you're going word, 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 word. And then you're trying to sort of look at the picture and then tell your own story. Then we want to have them pay attention to what the words mean together as a sentence. And then we need to help them pay attention to the things in the paragraph that give us the most important pieces of information. Okay, so that's how attention starts to get into this. And we have to help them with that. Relate new information to existing knowledge. I try to do that when I give you examples or tell you stories so that these things can kind of logically connect to something you already know to be true. And that way you pull and integrate that information into long-term memory much more efficiently. Remember that children can only think about a small amount of information at any one time. So we don't give multiple step directions at first. We have to work up to that. We need short, concise instructions. And explanations for why certain behaviors are not okay, right? That's not safe is better than we don't climb on the bookshelf because you could fall down and all of these things could happen. Like that's too much information and they won't process it. But if you say that's not safe and our rule is we don't do things that are unsafe, then you have just a few things that say don't climb on the bookshelf, okay? Consider verbal and nonverbal behaviors. Kids by the age of 3 are doing things like getting really quiet when they're sad. You know, nonverbal behaviors are ongoing. And then practice with conversation about experiences and teaching others, helping others, and more. And then more formal assessments are, of course, tests or whatever. Okay, so learning disabilities. Learning disabilities are where there is a deficit in one of these points of process. There is often a genetic component. It is likely to have a biological basis. There's just the way the neuroatypical brain works. They don't process things as quickly, or language is harder to process than visual, or math, numbers are harder to process than language. It all has to do with the parts of the brain that are involved in all of those sorts of computations and processing, or it can be a central executive function. That's why special education services are even necessary, because not everybody's brain works like, quote, the norm. And we have to be able to present information to them or give more time or in some other way give them additional structure in order to maximize their intellectual potential. So, ADHD. There is a weakness in central executive functioning. They're easily distracted, they daydream, they have trouble listening, trouble following directions, they give up easily. That is sort of the attentional piece of it. They have a hard time consciously focusing on what they consciously want to focus on. It's almost like they're not the boss of what their brain chooses to attend to. So they can become easily distracted by a sound or a thought or a song in their head, and they can miss instruction, or they can fail to focus on a worksheet that they're supposed to be doing because they got interested in the eraser on their pencil, that kind of thing. So it is a difficulty with that step of I choose what I attend to right now at will. Excess energy, so they're fidgety, they move around, they talk excessively. That is a failure also in the frontal lobe to inhibit impulses because of excess activity. You can have less activity, but also impulsivity. So if they know something, they can't stop themselves from blurting out the answers, interrupting, or they'll rush through things and they'll make careless mistakes and they act without thinking. So one of the things that the medication does is it slows this process down so that we can work with them on being able to attend and focus, because there aren't so many distracting activities going on, there's not as much energy, and there's not as much impulsivity. Okay? All right, so when you're working with someone who has a processing difficulty, you want to take a look at the children's works for clues about what it is, math, reading, whatever it might be, dyslexia. Help children keep their attention on the task at hand, so provide extra scaffolding for studying, more structure, okay? More structure, more potential teacher attention, a little bit breaking down things into smaller bits and pieces, and maybe altering some of the tasks that they have to do to maximize their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. Teach learning strategies. They will need, it's almost like you have to be more intentional with them, so you teach them new strategies to work around the things that they struggle with. And then manage your class schedule. If you have a bunch of kids who can't pay attention very well, you want to make sure that your instructions are short, sweet, structured, and that you're moving from topic to topic in a pretty decent way. Don't ask too much of them. And then some of them need some intentional work on social skills. All right, metacognition, knowledge about your own cognitive process. So let's say you have a disability. At what point do you understand that you have a learning disability? At what point are you able to think about your own cognitive process and intentionally use tips and tricks through your understanding of that process to improve learning and memory? I mean, we're working on that, and we want kids to understand that by first grade, don't we? Certainly by fourth. And then what is a strategy? A cognitive strategy is something that is used to intentionally regulate thinking. So a learning strategy. So one of those things that you're familiar with that you may not have labeled as a strategy before are things like rehearsal, repeating something over and over again, memorizing a speech, that kind of thing. Organization, remembering something by organizing it with categories, like so things like chunking would come into this in order to remember more things at a time, or creating schemas and that sort of thing. Elaboration is using prior knowledge to pull in and expand and integrate new knowledge. Okay, problem solving. It can appear by 12 months, so that's pulling a cloth to reach a string attached to a toy. Even animals can do this. All right, basic problem solving. It's usually very physical, but it becomes increasingly mental by school age. So applying rules. This balance task is something like put the bigger piece on the bottom and the smaller piece on the top if you want things to balance, right? So applying rules and understanding how the world works and what strategies you can use to achieve your goal. All right, so you'll see that what the whole thing that this is saying is that strategies start very simple, and then as you get older, your strategies can become more complex, and you can try different strategies, but each one will become more efficient, more flexible, and more successful, and you can integrate more complex things. So so you get better at strategies over time. Okay, metacognitive awareness is just your appreciation of your own thought process, understanding the limits of your own memory, and knowing what you need to do. I'm not going to remember this unless I take notes. Knowledge of the relative effectiveness of various learning strategies. What works for you? What kind of a learner are you? We want kids to understand this pretty quickly. Preschoolers are aware of the existence of thought, and I'm not sure how to explain that to you other than you just have to sit down and talk to some preschoolers. They will say things like, I'm thinking, or what are you thinking? You know, those kinds of things. They don't necessarily, trying to think of a good example. So for example, I was playing hangman with a 7-year-old. And my word was her name. And she thought that was pretty cool. Her next one that she did was my name. And it was super obvious. But it was not, she didn't know it would be obvious to me because she was not processing, well, if I use her name after she uses my name, she's going to know that that's what that is. Like, it didn't appear to her to be obvious. So there was some faultiness in kind of being aware of our own thought process. Obviously, language, you need language. For these higher ordered things, you need language, which is why we worry so much if a child is delayed in learning language, because it is so important for absolutely everything else. You have to have language to understand abstract concepts like knowing, remembering, forgetting, all of those sorts of things. And because all of those pieces of knowledge require symbolic thought, which requires language, which is why if we don't see language developing, we start to get worried and we intervene very quickly, because it will have an impact on absolutely everything else about learning. Okay, preschoolers are overly optimistic about memory. There's a reason for that. It's because when they're little, they remember everything about their childhood. And about 5 or 6, there's this thing called dendritic pruning. And all of a sudden, they forget a lot of their pre-verbal experiences. And it can be a very difficult time for them. It happens at about 5, 6 years old. Like Aunt Mary, they used to be able to remember Aunt Mary every year. But now they're 5 or 6 and they haven't seen Aunt Mary in a year, and that is gone for them. It was almost like a pre-verbal memory, and it gets pruned out for the sake of everything else they're learning, and the next thing you know, they don't remember Aunt Mary and they start to cry. Elementary school children are better able to reflect on their own thought process. They understand when things that they're doing are good or bad in comparison to others, which means they're very hard on themselves. They understand how they learn, they understand what they like, they understand what they don't like, and they can use strategies to learn things. You know, it almost starts with like using your fingers to count. That's a strategy, right? And then those things get more and more complex over time. Adolescents, so the reason they can still be metacognitively naive is because of that frontal lobe thing. They're still very driven by impulse and primitive thought. Until 26. All right, self-regulated learning. The ability to set your own goals. Now, we are dealing with this right now. You guys are dealing with this right now. I'm dealing with this right now. We're all working from home. We're all online. The kids are online. I have actually heard, I talked to somebody who said that their first graders are not being given work to do at home. Parents can either choose to do homeschooling or have the kid repeat first grade come fall because they feel like they're too young to be able to do an effective online education. And then there are others, first grades, that are getting work sent home and they're going to be learning online. So it's kind of interesting. But what this is all requiring, and the reason you guys feel so overwhelmed, and quite frankly, so do I, because I'm working from home, I'm managing other people from home, I'm now teaching you guys from home, technology gets screwed up, we have to organize our time. These are all things you have to learn. So setting goals for your own learning and what you're motivated to do, planning your study time and organizing your schedule, identifying the strategies that are working for you and those that aren't. If there are those of you out there that really need to connect with me sort of in real time because you feel like you're just not going to get it, please send me an email and let me know. I'm happy to set up Zoom video conferences or FaceTime conferences if you're struggling with this stuff. I really want you to get the most out of it. So if this is a terrible learning format for you and you're really struggling, let me know and I can kind of help you get into a groove. I've been trying to set up a pattern, but since we started off and you guys were super late in getting your stuff done, and then yesterday I had all kinds of technical difficulties trying to get these things recorded and uploaded all of a sudden. So we're kind of behind. So I'm trying to give you guys as much structure as possible from a distance. So if you need more of that from me, please let me know and I will just set up like office hours. Maybe I'll do that anyway. Maybe I'll send out an email and just say I'm going to set up office hours. So if you're struggling, you have a time where you know I'm available and we can do a FaceTime and kind of work through some stuff that you might be struggling with. You have to monitor your own progress, and then you have to evaluate the final knowledge that you've gained. So a lot of classes will have you do self-assessments about what you think you've learned and what you knew going in and then what you think you learned from it afterwards. Okay. So active mental engagement is universally valuable for academic achievement. However, lots of different cultures have different strategies that they use to learn and remember. It's just the case. If you look at different ways that kids in Asia learn different things, they have methods, and all of these different methods come from different cultures. And we can, learn from all of them, quite frankly. So what can you do to promote metacognition and strategic development? Engage children in discussions about thinking in the mind. This is really what happens in early childhood and early elementary school. Model and teach effective strategies. Encourage increasingly independent learning over time. Think of Montessori. And then provide opportunities for kids to evaluate their own learning, right? Oh, look what you did. What do you think you've learned? What did you get out of that activity? That kind of self-reflective stuff will definitely help. Okay, a personal theory. So let's talk about theories. So we have the scientific method, right? Why do we have the scientific method? Let's get a little meta here for a minute. The reason the scientific method is what it is, hypothesis, right? Hypothesis, data gathering, testing, conclusion, is because that is what we naturally do as human beings experiencing the world, okay? We have theories that we develop as children, and they can be integrated and complex explanations about the world. That's like those shows, Kids Say the Darndest Things, those kind of things. Those are all world theories that children have put together based on their limited experience and cognitive capacity. The reason it's funny is because they usually make these sweeping errors that we find hilarious. And part of learning is us correcting and modifying and expanding on the theories that children create in their own minds as they explore their world, okay? So infants, they have to know that objects are external to themselves, that happens, and that they have a definite boundary. The chair has a place where it starts and it stops. The ball has a place where it starts and it stops. It is the ball and it is not the ball, okay? That something will fall unless it holds them up. If they let go of the ball, it falls. And that things can move in a continuous manner across space. So if you throw the ball or you roll the ball, it moves through space to the other person. These are all theories about how the world works. They don't understand gravity, they don't understand it, but they do understand that if you don't hold on to it, it will fall. And they do this through Piaget's repetition and practice, right? That's how they develop these theories. So all of these things are foundational for the development of more elaborate theories, more abstract theories, more socially constructed theories. Relationships become involved in all of these things. So there is a certain amount of knowledge that's biologically pre-programmed, and then there you go. Misconceptions interfere with learning new concepts. So how do we help them develop their theories? We encourage and answer why and how questions. Why does that happen? How does that work? Then we say to them, what do you think? Those are the asking, challenging questions. What do you think happens? Present phenomena that children can't explain, and then ask them to think about it, and then share with them this new information and have them test the theory. Okay, so plants growing and watering and all of those sciencey things are about creating and exploring theories about the world and what's kind of out there in the world. Okay. All right, so take-home messages here. Cognitive processing, how children receive, think about and modify and remember information. The importance of sensation, perception, attention, and memory, that you become more aware of yourself and your thinking and the world and knowledge as you get older. And then that eventually children graduate or create these integrated belief systems or theories that we have to help them to modify and correct. Okay. All right.